Several weeks ago, a friend of mine in religious life sent me an email in which he was reflecting somewhat dramatically on the both tragic and comical situation of the present day, just everything going on in the world. He asserted that the tragically comic frequently results when people take themselves rather more seriously than they should. Now, I suspect that my canon friend was not intending to downplay the wretchedness of tragedy or the destructive effects of sin, as if such things are humorous or lighthearted. Far from it. He was simply underscoring the fact that in our fallen finitude, we have a tendency to behave in remarkably silly and absurd ways, to draw ridiculous conclusions, and to set our desires on the superbly mediocre and underwhelming. Our first reading, excerpted from the book of Exodus, is a remarkable case in point. We encounter the Hebrews today, recently led out of years of captivity and brutal servitude in Egypt. At the hands of Moses and Aaron, the Hebrews had witnessed incredible miracles, testifying to the supreme power and protection of God, culminating in the dramatic Passover event and the crossing of the Red Sea. Yet, in spite of these recently witnessed signs and wonders, the Hebrews have grown discontent in the midst of their desert sojourn. Would that we had died at the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, as we sat by our flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. The account in the book of Numbers goes on to list the specific kinds of food that they miss, leeks and onions and other such things. You can almost hear the pitiful whining wail. Never mind the fact that we were slaves, that we were not free, that we had to do all sorts of forced labor, that we could not worship God. We had the food we like. Silliness indeed. Last week we began our 5-week trek through John chapter 6, a sort of hiatus from going through the book of Mark as we've been doing in this year of the lectionary cycle. I mentioned last week that I want to avail ourselves of this time and these sections of John chapter 6, these segments that we hear in sequence, to ponder anew the marvelous gift of the Eucharist, the true bread come down from heaven. And I began those reflections by stepping back to consider the larger notion of the divine economy, the economy of grace, which is an economy not of scarcity and limitation, like human economies, but rather one of superabundance and plenitude. Today, our readings invite us to reflect on the opposite side of the coin of the divine economy. That is, if last week our readings invited us to consider the superabundance of grace when we heard the miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fishes, if last week's readings invited us to consider the superabundance of grace with which God's right hand is full, poised to pour out on his children, this week's readings invite us to reconsider the attitude we ought to have, the posture we ought to assume, the disposition we ought to adopt when confronted with the divine superabundance. What is the proper interior disposition that prepares us to encounter the divine superabundance and the generosity of God bestowed upon us in a special way through the sacraments? This is an important question because if approached with the wrong interior disposition, we risk missing out. You see, an improper, constricted, narrow, entitled disposition is a surefire way to miss out. Unlike the Hebrews described in our first reading, the Eucharist is most fruitfully approached obediently and expectantly, not cynically or ungratefully or unconfidently or in an entitled manner. I am owed this. The gift of the Eucharist is not bestowed on us in response to a demand or entitlement. The Eucharist is always and everywhere a gift. That's what grace is, and gifts always bear the most abundant fruit when they're received in a spirit of gratitude, creative expectation, and confident trust in the goodness of the giver of the gift. Narrow entitlement, I am owed this, God owes me grace. That attitude constricts the heart, which is so obvious in the absurd discontent of the Hebrews in our first reading, and in the demand that the Lord perform in our gospel reading. What sign can you give us that we may see? Keep in mind, he has just multiplied the loaves and fishes. And yet they're still asking, what sign can you give us that we may see? What can you do? In other words, perform for us. Do something that will impress us. But these demands are grounded in entitlement and selfishness rather than in a spirit of humble, grateful receptivity, grounded in trust in the giver. The entitled attitude always erects blinders and prevents us from being attuned to the superabundance of divine grace that overflows into unexpected places and people and gifts. When approached with entitlement, even the Eucharist starts to seem underwhelming. Like the Hebrews, upon seeing manna for the first time, we might even ask, what is this that seems so plain and boring and ordinary? Can't you do something for us, God? But when approached in a posture of receptive gratitude and trust, the significance of the gift of the Eucharist unfolds, and we become aware of the Lord's unflagging loyalty in remaining with us, his humility, his faithful and persistent pursuit, the love that loves to the end. When we step back and acknowledge the Eucharist for what it is, the Paschal mystery made present here and now, entitled demands to do or perform falter on our lips, and we're reduced to silence, overcome as we are by the truth that the Lord has already done the most marvelous of deeds by his passion, death, and resurrection. He has redeemed us. The daily celebration of the Eucharist plunges us into that greatest of mysteries, the Lord's passion, death, and resurrection, such that the things of earth should grow strangely dim in its glorious light, a light which makes worldly priorities appear insignificant and trivial human demands appear even comical.